Well, we want to talk about now what we've done in the past with gun violence and also talk about is it time to change our approach. Joining me now is Louise Russo. Louise and I met, unfortunately, after 2004 when you were shot. You were an innocent victim buying a sandwich at California Sandwiches,
Right.
and you were hit by a bullet and caught up in gang violence. And it left you in the chair, unfortunately. Chris Glover is the newly elected NDP MPP for Spadina-Fort York, but as a member of the Board of Health, you also put some interesting proposals forward about perhaps changing an approach to gun violence. So let me start with Louise, because Louise, you've taken this on that the chair is not going to be your be-all and end-all. You are going to make something very positive out of this, and I admire you, and I always have. We've been in touch over the years. Tell me about the work that you're doing with your anti-violence movement, and also some of the conversations that you had very recently during Anti-Crime Week.
Sure. Well, I started up a charity. It's working against violence every day, Louise Russo Wave, and it's to recognize young people who've made a difference in community and schools through anti-violence initiatives. We also do a Wave Youth Empowering Day and bringing kids together and giving them hope and knowing that there's always, they can make a difference regardless of how small the gesture would be. So we talk a lot about that. We just had our 11th annual one. But I also go in and speak to incarcerated youth. And, you know, I really want to hear what they have to say. And it's interesting because when we're a small group, and I remember being at one of these sessions, and this young man just kept tapping, and you could see he was fidgeting a lot. It was really, so I finally just said, you know what, why don't you just say what you have to say? Because it seems like you have a lot to say, but you're holding back. And if it's too personal, I'll let you know. And he just, I remember him slamming his fist on the table and just saying, I want to know why you're not retaliating, why you don't want to just kill them. And he goes, why aren't you angry? Why are you sitting there so calm? And the whole room just looked at me, and social workers were there, parole officers, and I just looked at him and just let it settle for a minute, and I said, I'd be lying to you if I said I wasn't angry. Of course I'm angry that I can't get out of bed on my own. My independence is gone. So my whole life has changed. I said, but look what's happening to you right now. And I said, look. In there? I said, no. I said, look what's happened. Look at your body language. Look at your hands that are clenched in a fist, and you're so angry. You can see the veins popping from your throat and stuff. And I said, look at your voice. I said, what are you doing to yourself? I said, so if you retaliate, you're just creating another cycle of violence.
Right, and that's often what happens in these cycles of violence, and with shootings in the city, we know it's often retaliatory. Exactly. Chris, one of the programs that you suggested when you were a member of the Board of Health is totally looking at addressing violence in a different way, and one of those is using the inmates after they've served their time.
Right, so it's an interrupters program that they use in Chicago, and they've used it in Halifax and other cities around North America and in Europe as well. And so it's a matter of bringing somebody in to the community who has the credibility, who can negotiate a nonviolent solution to conflict. Because people will always have conflict, but how do we get to the nonviolent solutions? You know, and that's what the Interrupters program is about. That's what the public health approach is about. But the public health approach is also about addressing the trauma. You know, and when we're thinking about these two girls today, you know, and you know, we're all praying for these girls because it's just something that should not have happened. You know, and it's just appalling that it did. But it's not just those two girls that are impacted or their families. It's also, you know, the other 9 children that were in that playground and the entire neighborhood. And there are neighborhoods in our city where they have brand new playgrounds, but the parents don't let the children go play there because they don't feel it's safe. And so we need to change our approach. We need to change our public policies so that everybody feels safe everywhere at all times. And that, you know, these kinds of incidents just aren't happening.
Louise, when you go in and you speak to these inmates, do you feel when they release, and sometimes they're only in there for a few years, do you feel they would be ready to step up into a program that Chris is suggesting that they would take? One
of the issues that I felt that would be, you know, when they're young, a lot of them are still in school, and it's the transition back into school. They don't feel accepted. They don't feel they're wanted. And so what are they going to do? They're going to stay with the group that, you know, they're just going to go back into it. And one of the, also going back into the communities, I've said to them, I said, I want to put a challenge forward. Said, you know, dealing with paralysis is not easy every day. We have issues of one way or another, but I do the best you can. So I said, I want to put a challenge. When you go back into your communities, it's easier for you to go back and do what you were doing. And learned a lot more while you were here. Said, but what a challenge would it be for you to go back and be a role model in your community and teach the young ones of what not to do.
And that credibility, if they can bring that credibility and they can find the strength within themselves, it will make a difference. There's proof of that in other jurisdictions?
Yes, yeah, so this program, the Interrupters program, where it's been implemented, in every case it has reduced the number of shootings. And so it is something that the city should be looking at. It's something that the Board of Health has voted to, to investigate.
Is there a cost? Is there, is there an operation
it's a social
cost?
program. I'm sure there is, yeah. I mean, it's a matter of recruiting people and using our social services that we've already got, but also adding a little bit to that as well. But I mean, the alternative cost, is what we've got, and this is something, like gun violence, there are 400 shootings a year in Toronto. And you think about the trauma that comes from that. And that's something that we need to address. And, especially on days like today, we're thinking, really clearly about this and really we're focused on this. And we need to make sure that we stay focused so that we're not just, responding, we're actually dealing with the issues. And in this case, we need to find out exactly what happened. And we don't know that yet.
Well, let's do this. Let's pick up our discussion because it's not over. And when we come back, what we want to see if Toronto actually needs to admit that there is a safety problem in this city, because often we hear from politicians after this, our city is safe, but do we need to hear something different? So we'll tackle that when we come back. Well, we want to pick up our discussion on what we really need to do to address the gun violence issue in this city. And are we hearing enough from our politicians? And do we need to change the way we even address gun violence in the city? Joining me is a shooting victim, Louise Russo, and also an anti-violence advocate now. And Chris Glover, who is the newly elected NDP MPP for Spadina-Fort York. But you also worked on some anti-violence strategies when you were with the Board of Health here in Toronto. And let's talk, maybe Chris will start with you, because we heard from the Premier Designate today. He said that he is going to support Toronto Police and give them all the resources they need. That was the quote. What does that actually mean? What resources does Toronto Police need?
I mean, there's an immediate response, and so we need to find the people who did the shooting today, and we need to make sure that they're, behind bars and that the community is safe, that they're not further endangering people. But then we need to recognize that, gun violence is a symptom of a much deeper problem. And we need to deal with that deeper problem, because the police alone are not going to be able to solve this issue.
So you're a provincial politician now. How can the province support the local municipalities?
So one of the things that we asked for through the Toronto Board of Health is a research project on the trauma. So how extensive, how many people are exposed to community violence or to gun violence in this city? And what is the impact on them? And I'll give you one example. One gentleman that I work with from the Communities for Zero Gun Violence, he said that he was speaking with a grade 8 group of 30 students, after-school program, and he asked them, how many of you know someone who's been killed by gun violence in the past 2 years? And every one of them put up their hand.
Oh, that is so tragic, isn't it?
And it's not, it's pockets in the city, and we need to address that in the pockets.
Louise, I want to ask you, we often hear after these shootings, or after the spate of shootings, and since 2004, since the summer of the gun in 2005, we know there have been cycles of these gun crimes. And often we hear from the mayor, the police chief, politicians alike, don't worry, our city is safe. Is it actually time to change that and admit that our city isn't safe?
I believe it's time that we work together with community members, with police, community leaders, survivors of gun violence, advocates, and to come up with some strategies and and also inmates. I believe it's very important for people that want to change their lives and what they can do in their communities.
And at the provincial level, you're working with Victims of Crime, the organization. So what are you advising the government? What are you advising the province on steps that they should take?
Developing strategies, working together, and coming up with we need to hear from members in the community too. Exactly what are the issues in those communities, and how you know, how can we work collaboratively together and come up with these solutions? Because there's got to be something. We want to keep Toronto safe. We wanted to. I remember Toronto being called Toronto the Good. I love that.
Right.
And we want to continue, you know, with that. It's a beautiful city, and we need to keep that.
Well, let's do this. We're going to continue our discussion in a few minutes, and let's talk more about the role of communities and what communities actually need to do. So thank you for joining us right now. So for more than an hour, I've been talking with my guests about what we can do to change the talk on gun violence in this city. We've talked about some very unique programs that hopefully may be brought to the city. We've talked about the political involvement and what needs to happen there, changing the dialogue. But Louise, in our last chat, you were talking about the community and what the community needs to do, because often the community feels victimized. But how do they not be a victim?
You know, I was just recently invited to during Victims of Crime Week and to a community event, and to hear mothers of children who have passed because of gun violence, and also people that have been injured, and the impact that it's had, the trauma, like Chris had mentioned a little bit earlier. It's a ripple effect. It never just affects the victim; it's the family, the community, and but it was amazing to see that the Toronto Police was there, and you know, other community leaders and other members, and we were all talking, and we had a lot of youth. It's important to involve our youth in this, and to hear their voice, to give them, you know, a say in that. And so those are what needs to be done more within the city, that I found was very impactful.
How do we ensure, Chris, that we actually give the community a voice and they feel that they can speak out?
You know, I think this is one of the issues that a lot of people talk about is, you know, they're afraid to talk. And they're afraid to report because, you know, every one of these murders, somebody knows who did it. And they're afraid to report because they're afraid of the retaliation. So the question is, how do we as a society make people safe so that it's safe for them to report? And that's a bigger question.
Well, let's actually tackle that question, because so often, and we always do, we report, call Crime Stoppers if you know something. But we hear time and time again from police that those calls aren't coming. And even in this incident, there were a lot of people around, but they were afraid to speak out. So how can government, politicians make them feel more comfortable?
You know, I think part of it is, you know, making people feel safe, but it's also a matter of changing the nature of our communities. Because we've got growing pockets of poverty. We've got a growing gap between rich and poor. And so long as that's happening, as long as there's that those intense pockets of poverty, we're going to see more of this.
But we're seeing changing neighborhoods and gentrification. Spadina, Fort York, which is your riding, we're seeing a lot of high-rises, a lot of density, and a lot of mixed-use housing. Is that part of the solution, the mixing and
Absolutely.
all that?
The Regent Park, what they're doing in Regent Park is transforming that community, so it is a mixed-use community, and that's the direction that we need to go. That's one of the directions that we need to go in.
And making places safe for families to walk out and making people feel comfortable. How can we change that in the city?
Well, no one should feel that they should be looking behind their back or around all the time. We should be able to take our children to the playground. We should be able
to go to a restaurant and order a sandwich.
Exactly, or, you know, where you worship, and like, you should feel safe wherever. And I think it's communities, like, you know, we need to speak up. We need to rally together. It's really important, and to work together in partnership, collaboration with the police, with community leaders, with members of the community and our youth. Very important to involve them.
And can there be, you know, so much of the relationship between police and the community is very divisive right now. How can we start to repair that relationship to get some of the action that you're talking about?
I think
I know we don't have enough time to tackle that. That's a whole other discussion, but it's got to start somewhere.
I mean, there has to be an open dialogue between the communities and with the police, and an open and frank conversation about what the communities need and what's happening to them.
And I think you're key on that, the open and frank dialogue with open ears. So thank you both for your insights over the last hour and a half. Really appreciate you both coming in.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.